already. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Diane Bolet today to talk about his work in progress paper on the impact of localized policies on political behavior, among other things. It builds on her work on far right voting and local deprivation and public policies. She's currently an assistant professor in political behavior at the University of Essex, where she just joined from the University of Zurich. We were just talking before about the differences in institutional context and financial resources across these two countries, and other fun things that are happening in Britain right now. And to discuss the paper, we're privileged to also have with us Dr. Katja Salomo, who has just joined us as our new Dahrendorf fellow here at the ESC from the VZB in Berlin, which was working on mobility, social inequality, neighborhood segregation, and deprivations, among other highly relevant topics. So I think it's a very good match. You have this localized aspect to your project. So then look forward to hearing the talk for the next 30 minutes,
yes,
and then 10-15 minutes of discussion by Katja. So Diane, of course.
Thank you. First of all, thanks so much for inviting me. I was just saying how beautiful this place is. It's quite a sharp contrast from Manchester, I would say. But I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for joining. So the project I'm presenting is somewhat new, continuation of my existing research. So just to kind of situate what I'm doing, so a lot on local context, but I'm primarily interested in like the political behavior of communities that are adversely affected by structural changes. And so in my previous work, I've been particularly focusing on deindustrialization and rising immigration and how that could push them communities, distressed communities, to vote for the far right. And today I'm kind of interested in a new type of transition, a huge structural change that we are witnessing in a moment, which is the green transition. And if you think again how we were thinking back in the 70s and the winners and losers, when you think of one specific group that are going to be the primary group that is losing from this green transition, this group is the farmers. And so this is kind of how we started this project. And this is, I should mention, a project that emerged when I was still at the University of Zurich with my colleague Georgia, who is actually the lead author for this part of the project. And as Tim was saying, this is kind of a new research agenda for me. So we were lucky to have received some Swiss National Foundation, so some money for to continue this project for the next 4 years. So I think this is perfect timing to kind of brainstorm some ideas, whatever ideas you may have on what we can implement, which we might be able to do in the future. I think this is something that doesn't really happen often when you look into research. And so for today, it's kind of the first part, it's kind of the starting point of what we're interested in, is just to see if there's some policy feedback of the most generous policy in the EU, as we all know, the Common Agricultural Policy, and if it's kind of a way to mitigate potential rural resentment that we witness today. And that's kind of starting from the vast literature that we're witnessing today, which is on the emerging rural resentment. So as we know, following the knowledge economy, process of agglomeration and globalization, we've seen a divide between cities that are becoming more prosperous and thriving, and rural areas that are declining, they suffer from depopulation, lack of public service provision, and as a result of that, we're starting to witness a political divide between those the cities that are flourishing and also with geographic sorting and some contextual effects. We're seeing that more socially progressive individuals want to live there and tend to vote for more mainstream parties, which is more like left-leaning parties. And on the other hand, we see in rural areas what we call this rural resentment, this kind of grasping new grievances, economic, cultural grievances that lead some of those communities to be lured by the far right, because they kind of embody this idea taking back control from what has been lost. And so that's why we see more and more of this community, such as this, racially aggregated, like is supporting the far right. So this is kind of like the first part, the starting point of this research. And the second one is, and that's kind of what been the conclusion of my early work, is like, so what can we do about this? We do witness this divide. What could be policies, and we've seen it, a lot in the UK, that policies have become really popular, like leveling up. It's kind of place-based policies that try to mitigate this rural resentment, and how effective that is. I mean, the evidence is very scarce and quite mixed. If you look at the social cohesion funds in the EU, there's some levels of aggregation it's quite hard to grasp what is the actual effect and how is it targeting the individuals. But on the whole, the effects are relatively either non-existent, or even if there is an effect, it's very small. So we don't really know if place-based policies can actually do something to mitigate this rural resentment. And when we think of this growing interest coming from the US, we think of Kramer, we think of Justin Guest, on this idea of rural resentment and rural groups that are supporting the far right, there tends to be a group that is neglected in this idea of what we mean by rural voters. They are the farmers. And the farmers, even though they might be in small and smaller numbers, they do have a certain electoral clout. And we've been witnessing that in just the last year, because they do embody the new grievances, as I said earlier, as a kind of new voice of discontent related to move towards regionalization and imposing new environmental regulations. And we've seen in countries like the Netherlands, this kind of the BBB group that is now protesting against the use of pesticides or nitrogen quotas, as we saw in Ireland. This is kind of this new protest voting group that has been created, that's emerging. And so they're quite influential. The BBB is the second largest party in the Netherlands. I mean, not really says a lot when you think of the Netherlands being so divided into maybe like at least 29, I think, today, 29 parties. But on top of that, the farmers also, oh, sorry, that was the news. They're also quite influential at the EU level. They have a very strong, powerful lobby group. And we've seen that recently with the nature of the restoration law. So we saw that the Kofiga lobby group managed to scale back some of the ambitious goals of this law, and they were very close to actually reject the law. So it's kind of a signal that they are powerful. They also, get them, as I said, most generous policies, but they do have a certain like political influence at the level. All right, thanks. And so in this paper, as I said, this is a new project that it will be ongoing for the next 3 to 4 years. But we kind of wanted to have a sense of what is going on and what are the electoral returns of the Common Agricultural Policy funding. It's kind of just to see if there's any effect this kind of policy. So you might say it's not really place-based, I agree with it, I agree with you, it's not place-based, like individual income support for farmers. But just to see if there is any relation to whether you're having more can actually reduce or have an effect on what we call rural resentment, which will be measured by support for rural. And so that's the kind of the first part we're interested in, and that's unfortunately all I can show you today. But we've been doing some ongoing interviews for the past 4 months. So we've been interviewing with head of farmers associations. We've done 10 interviews so far, and we've given a really good insights of what are, so first of all, the relationship between the farmers and the Common Agricultural Policy. They know how much they get, if they get it, how often do they get it, where it comes from, they know it comes from the EU. But also they have some grievances. What are those grievances? And it was very insightful because we got some ideas to do the third task, which is something we're trying to do, and this is where today is really great because we can brainstorm some ideas. But we'll then do a survey where we'll target, thanks to the Farmers Association, we'll actually send mails. Some of them don't have internet, and we'll try to hopefully get as many responses possible from French farmers, and we'll do a survey, but also potentially a survey to members. Up to us to decide. So this is, today, I can only show you, as I said, the first part, but it's kind of already interesting to know whether it's worth investigating and things like that. And I hope I'll convince you that it is. And we found some interesting findings. And so to go back to this idea of just the effect of the common agricultural policy on farmers, we need to think of the theory behind it. And so, as you probably all know, this policy feedback effects are pretty straightforward. And what's interesting there is the conditions to which they may apply, like the policy feedback effects may exist. So what is important is for the policy, so think again of the common agricultural policy, and I'll explain a bit more about what that one is in this context, but it is important that the benefits are large, they're durable, so they've been ongoing for years, that they're also visible with individuals, right? It needs to be able to track back to the recipient and the beneficiaries, and that it's also relatively proximate. This is important. I don't want to spoil too much, but I'll tell you why in a few minutes. And yeah, the kind of straightforward mechanism will be some idea of the resource effect, right? When you get some positive benefits, you will actually be more supportive of. Yeah, this is a part of the theory I feel is a bit missing some pieces, but there should be sort of positive feedback if there is income benefits, and that means you're maybe more supportive of the incumbent and maybe less inclined to vote for new fringe parties. But it could also backlash, like it could be a backlash effect, in the sense that receiving this money could be perceived as bribing them if people get more compensation, and this is something that's really common especially in the green transition in some like carbon dependent areas and communities. Mostly based on US evidence, they tend to neglect all the money that they receive from the US, from the state, or from the federal state, in those coal mining and the Appalachian communities, because they perceive them to be just a way to bribe them to vote for them in the next election. So there, the opposite mechanism could be a negative effect. And so now we apply this to the common agricultural policy, and as I said, I think it fits really well with all the conditions I just explained. It is very large and durable, so it's been ongoing since the 60s. It is huge and it's very generous, but also important for the farmers. Based on interviews we had, 40% of farmers will not be able to sustain the business without it. So it is crucial, it is necessary for them to continue the farm, and that's something the farmers are aware of. So based on interviews we had, they know it comes from most of them know they comes from the EU. Again, we'll prove that, we'll try to test that with the survey. It is visible because they know every year how much they're getting. They know that it comes from the EU. There's like a little logo coming every year and telling them that this is what you're going to get this year. And what's also interesting, and something we're just trying to be investigating a bit more, is that since 2014, there's been a new conditionality, like a new regulation, that farmers need to comply to environmental farming practices. So there are environmental payments tied to the existing funds they receive, and farm support they receive. We do need to because it's still a little bit unclear as to us that if this is an additional fund or if it's a replacement of their previous income support they received, because that could also have an effect, and it's something that will matter to us. So this is something we're still trying to figure out. It's trying to get more and more information on the common agricultural policy, like what all practices and how a lot of people actually don't already know the machine behind it. And so we're talking with the heads of the Farmers Association, and so far they told us that it is a little bit unclear how this environmental payment come from. So we need to do a little more investigation about it, a little bit more again in a few minutes. Yeah, and so what's interesting there is that again, this fund is quite targeted and towards individuals that are, based on interior life, tend to be more socially conservative. So as we said, they live in rural areas, tend to be white, they tend to be sort of older, large proportion of men. So it kind of fits all this kind of demographics that will show these people may hold more conservative views. And so there's this kind of like this interesting puzzle for this paper. It's like, how do socially conservative individuals respond to receiving a very generous policy from the EU, which is one of the bodies that you would suspect is the body they tend to resent. Yeah, so yeah, we don't know much about farmers. There's been a few articles on it, but not from a very quantitative, like working from a sociological viewpoint. So it's still a bit unclear who they vote for. But the last survey available to us in France was again, I forgot to mention it was in France. I guess you see France everywhere, so I'm like, okay, don't need to mention that. But from the last survey we got, actually it's like huge, so you can't see it, but it's over like 20,000 respondents, and among them there was like 500 were farmers, so we thought, okay, that's relatively large. And we were just interested in who they were voting for, and you can see from the 2004. But you can see that farmers are more inclined to vote for right-leaning parties compared to the rest of the population. So voting for mainstream right, agrarian, not so much. Actually, I was a bit surprised, but also the agrarian party in France are not so powerful, I would say. And then a lot of them more like inclined to vote for far right. And also interesting that to see that they're also more inclined to abstain from voting. That was from 2004. Of course, hopefully with the survey, we'll have a better sense of their voting preferences. All right. Okay. So here are the hypotheses for the this first project that we have in mind. So it's kind of following, straight from the policy feedback hypothesis, and so we want to test whether receiving more funds. So again, this is the income support. I'll tell you more when we only focus on the income support. It's mostly due to lack of access to the other funds, but so the income support over time, it's also 80% of the overall support. So this is huge. This is usually all they get. So whether farmers receive more of it, as a result, we think that there will be, well, by hypothesis, as we argue, that there will be less support in the rental right. So they'll be less inclined to have this rural resentment. So far, we've only collected support for a radical right. We will try to broaden that to other parties. But that's kind of the straightforward resource hypothesis based on combining this urban-rural divide story with the policy feedback argument. And the conditionality hypothesis, so that's the second more tentative hypothesis, which, yeah, it's still a little bit unclear to us, but we assume that farmers who would receive a higher share of funds, and those funds are tied to the environmental payments, because we see these people, farmers seem to be more socially conservative, they might reject this payment even more because it's kind of incongruent with their attitude and preferences. So as a result, they might be more aligning with the far right, either with discontent. It's kind of a way to encapsulate this this kind of agricultural discontent that we've seen in the recent months, where our farmers feel like they're imposed to move towards a green transition with more grain farming practices and less use of pesticides or not having nitrogen quotas and things like that. That's how we would assume this, but I'm not so sure about this hypothesis anymore. It's also like, again, going back to the how are the environmental payments allocated to farmers, and something we need to figure out. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you today, but that's something we have to discuss and study more. Thanks. And so here comes the research design, and here's something we have to do what we have. So initially, we were quite excited with this project. We've got we're looking at the French data. We already have existing contextual data we've collected before, and we can just easily merge this with the common agricultural policy funding at the individual level, because this data is available from the EU for the last 2 years. And the problem is we've been starting talking to French bureaucrats, and I forgot how annoying it can be sometimes, but they didn't give us access to the individual level data because of what they call surface statistics. So it's like a strange way to say they just don't want to share anything, any data with us, even though it is available at the EU level for the last 2 years. But anyway, so we are left with the lowest level of aggregation we could have access to after months and months, I would say 7 months of trying to get access to it. And so we got the cantonal level data on common agricultural policy payments. So in the paper it's since 2015, but 2 weeks ago we got access from 2008, so we pulled that all together. So the results might actually be new. And so we have the share total as CP funding. So Kansas, by the way, they're around 1,600, so it's still relatively large. Doesn't mean much to people, I have to say. Like most of the French residents don't know which Canton is part of. But it is kind of an indicative way. If we do find something, then we can maybe explore further and maybe merge that with the individual level survey that we have. So this is why the start of this presentation was a lot about focusing on farmers, but now with the research design, it's a little bit more aggregated than that. Of course, there's not many farms for Cantons because it's still relatively small. It's like on average, like 10,000 people living in Cantons. So we would assume we actually got like I would say on average 3 to 5 farms. So it's still, we could have some interesting findings there. We also have the share environmental payments from 2014, so that's when it was starting, and it actually made a change in funding. So the kind of variables we collected are national election results for the national rally and turnout. So we also now in the process of collecting data for other parties. But this is kind of what, from the puzzle we had, we were most interested in the effect on the direct support for the national rally. And then the other method is like, go to fixed effects, where we also control for unemployment, so tons of cantonal contextual share, but what we're interested in is the within cantonal change. Because we are aware that there's a lot of differences by farm size, sectors, so I think we're more interested in the change within the canton over. Go ahead.
Do you mind if I ask you, Karen?
No.
Yes, thank you.
I might have missed this, sorry. So just the support for national rally, is that versus everything? What's the denominator?
Is the percentage of support for the national rally per canton, because it's aggregated.
Denominator is everyone else.
Yes.
Okay.
So, and it's actually mentioned the first round of the election. So, because we have a 2 runoff, and the first one is usually considered more expressive voting because you get to choose which one you like most, whereas the second round you have to do more tactical voting. So it is the percentage of support for the right. Same for term. But this is why I think we need to look at because of the positive feedback effect and the role of incumbents, we need to collect data on mainstream parties, especially I would say the right-wing party. Because I think, I don't want to spoil the result, but I think this is probably what's going on there. All right. Cool. Okay. On to the findings. Unfortunately, I don't have beautiful graphs in the table, so I'm just finalizing yesterday. But what we do find is there is a in line with our hypothesis. So a increase in savings, so combined agricultural payments, equal to the median change per canton. That makes sense. Decreases the level of support for the national rally by around 1.5%. And you can see here, you can't see here, but it's 2.5% if you only look at raw canton, raw cantons. So there's an effect, and it's relatively strong. We're a bit surprised whenever you try to implement it, you're like, okay, it's not going to work. You're going to have to try many different ways. And it worked out straight away. It worked from here 2015 to 2022, and now it worked from 2008 till now. So we do see an effect there. It's also similar in EU elections. So when you look at 2014 and 2019, the effect is just half the size, so it's less strong for EU elections, which somebody will have to think more about why, and also the effect might be not so much about the magnitude, but why do we see similar direction effect with election and EU and national elections. But there's no effect on screen now. So it's not that, and that's the same for national and EU elections. So it's not so much that the cantons that receive more income support from the CAP mobilizing more to vote for the far right. It is that there's some vote switch going on between one parties or several parties to another. And this is why we are currently collecting data on right-wing parties. And also about all the other parties, which might be, tell us a bit more about what's going on here. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, turnout, I mean, the effect is relatively consistent, I would say there's not much going on as well, although with the controls there is, but it's not really consistent when we try various models. Now onto the green payments, and this is where I don't want to make too much of it, because the effect is a little bit inconsistent and goes all over the place. So on turnout, this is due to areas that, cantons that receive more green payments are actually more that are turning out to vote. Even more people living in this canton that receive green payments. But then the effect is going reverse, so there's less support for far-right parties. That's for national elections, but for EU elections, it's really inconsistent where we vary by whether we include regional fixed effects, for instance, whether we include controls, or we always include the lag dependent variable here. But it is like there's not much we can do, and I think we need to think back about what is actually how it's being allocated before we really make any sense of how that can mean to voting behavior. So those are like early conclusions, and a few more slides, and then a few questions since we had so much time. I think I'll just use that to my benefit. But first of all, I feel like there is something going on here, even though it's still only at the intentional level. We do see a link between receiving more financial assistance and being less inclined to support the radical right. Again, is it the best rule backlash? Remains to be seen. But it doesn't seem to be an effect on turnout. We need to know where this effect really goes to, like which party is benefiting from it. We, based on suspicion, might be the right-wing parties. One thing we just did yesterday is we did an interaction effect. It's like a way to, like a value test. Like we saw that the effect is stronger when the agricultural workforce in the canton is larger. So it's kind of free treatment. So it's kind of indicative that there is clearly a link between the farms and the size of the farms and how many there are, and this effect ongoing practices. So we would assume it is directly linked to the farmers, but again, we can't really make this kind of assumption just yet. As for the green payments, as I said, we need to understand better where it comes from, where they're located. Is it from small farms that tend to be more organic, do they receive more because they're already on a path towards green transition? Or is it that the larger farms, more industrialized, that have to do a lot more to transition and tend to be more skeptical or receiving more? So it is a little bit unclear. One way to proxy that will be, I'm not so sure we should do it, is to look at the existing like pre-trend far right vote share pre-2008, to assume maybe in those areas that already exist in like resentment, maybe the effect will be stronger because already areas when you assume more socially conservative. Anyway, we already know that. So again, something we have to do more research on. But anyway, there is something out there. We're interested in cost benefit calculation and whether that can trump role identity concern. And this is why the next step I think is crucial because we can't really make a lot of conclusions from now. But what we want to do is also based on the interview we received, is to focus a lot more on the different sector. Like there's some sectors where you have to, it requires much more work to transition, like to green practices. For instance, if you compare between cereals and more like livestock. So that's something we need to look into. We're trying to get access to this data, with satellite data, so we can't have it at an individual level. We want to explore the introduction of the green conditionality a bit more, so understand what it comes from. And also finally, and I'll stop here, one more minute, but we're also interested in, and I think what the most interesting step is to understand why. If you do find this pattern, why is receiving more funds will actually mitigate this rural resentment or leads to decline support for the far right. And so this is kind of my questions to you, and those are like something we're studying, like what kind of questions we can ask to farmers, and there's a lot of like straightforward ideas, some responsible feedback, retrospective accountabilities, and people tend to reward the incumbents, so less inclined to vote for the far right if they receive more funds. Maybe it's just they to like the EU a bit more, but again, is it about the EU or is it about the government? So those are the kind of questions we'll have to ask. And then, of course, something that's huge in the far right is also something that came back a lot in interviews, is more cultural, this idea of kind of recognition. We hear a lot that farmers need to be considered, they think they consider the dirty polluters in society, and they're hated by society, yet they're the one providing basic needs, food. And so they feel like they are, so they could kind of tie to the whole existing far right issue on the feeling not recognized, not valued by society. So that could be something else we might want to explore as well. And then a bunch of other things, these individual versus group-based questions. I talked a lot about farmers as a uniform entity, but there might be some differences, already differences based between the farm sector, but also farm size, between from smaller farms, between more organic. You might have different identities and preferences than if you're working for a large corporation. Yeah, and then I think I'm done, or is there something else? Oh yes. And then yeah, like is it worth doing a survey experiment? So another thing I did mention that came a lot in interviews is something else that farmers feel that could be a form of grievance, is the sense that they have to adapt a lot, whether it's like environmental regulations or other things that are imposed by the EU. Yet they see a lot of trade agreements at the EU level being done with non-EU member states. For instance, with Australia and New Zealand, where they bring a lot of livestock, and those countries are not bound by any regulations. And that's another form of resentment that is coming a lot in the interview. So that's also something we're interested in, and we might want to test that with this survey experiment. We talk about short policy brief, and we'll add a few things. So share, varying who is the direct contributor to that, whether it's EU, national government, the type of conditionality, whether the income is tied with green payments or not, and also maybe the external context, whether that's something we've just been thinking about, whether they also read that another agreement has just been signed at EU level, where this country doesn't actually comply with any of the EU's conventions, and how that leads to any resentment. So those are the things that, again, open. Any questions? And I think I'm already over time. I'll just stop here. And as I said, it's a very early, exciting new project for me. So if I misunderstood anything related to farmers, I apologize in advance, but look forward to your comments.
And I have found that speakers always say they only the whole time, but end up taking the whole time.
I know, I mean,
I'm not sure if we get feedback from the farmers here, but we will get feedback now from our discussion, then from the room. Katja, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Diane, for this very important paper. I would like to emphasize how important this kind of research is by talking a bit more about how left behind places, so-called left behind places, forgotten places, places that are never that you will be going to, typically emerge in European countries. Why we are so trying to work for the developing parties to understand which roles these farming subsidies can play in these countries. So that of course my research sector is and how to enhance your paper even further. Mainly focusing on the presumed relationship between left behind places and farmers as a social group as a political group. When we already talked about all results will be changing, so I didn't really focus on too much. So I think it's very important to understand that not all rural areas in Europe are left behind places with problematic voting behaviors or patterns, and indeed mid-sized town can become left behind. Ever-growing urbanization, other mechanisms you have mentioned play a big role in that, but there's always something more. Either a shock, like the decline of manufacturing in Northern England, either due to urbanization or maybe tension. In the German war, the financial crisis that hit regions in Southern Europe, countries especially big hard, or indeed the industrialization of East Germany and other Eastern European countries after the Alternatively, these left-behind places can emerge owing to prolonged phases of lack and low non-investments, like the empty diagonal in France, like areas in southern Italy, and indeed in all other European countries except the Netherlands, Denmark, and of course Luxembourg. These countries have such high population densities and wealth that, according to the OECD, they don't really have these systems. If there is a shock to the community, unemployment, as you can imagine, rises. Sure. We could assume that this experience of high unemployment already explains why far-right parties are so successful in these areas. But research doesn't really support that. The meta study is looking into unemployment as contributed to far-right voting either on the individual level or communist level. Comes to the conclusion it heavily depends on the broader context. And its effect is not that strong, so it's not high unemployment. Of course, the unemployed over time leave these places, looking for jobs, obviously. So that would be a moment when selection takes place. Right? You mentioned them already indirectly, I think. So what are selection effects in this context? Political psychology tries to boil down political attitudes to more basic dispositions. And indeed, openness towards new experiences, a trust towards outsiders, new people, strangers, seems to be linked to the willingness to migrate and also to let things within happens. The similar link exists between higher education and humanities. But at this point in the story, it's not about who wants to live, but who has to live. So selection effects don't really come to play just yet. While all this is going on, you have some development over time. Children, of course, are still growing up in these places, constantly exposed to decline. And they feel like we have to leave to make this. They might not be totally on balance. So after secondary, after they reach secondary education, they leave. And of course, now these selection effects will be different because this second phase of our migration, these places usually experience, is highly selective. It's young, it's highly educated, it's depending on where you're more often female than male people, they are more liberal-minded and they leave. These selection effects start to affect local culture and also selection outcomes. And we can these in some local country where these kinds of selection effects are in the democracy. These young people, they don't just take their little attitudes with them, they also take their little children, they make grades, the taxes they make paid, and indeed they are spending on consumer behavior. Indeed, market research is an element. People under 35 are like the most important customer group, consumer group. So shops, businesses, all kinds of services in these places that are already struggling now lose this important customer. And these shops start to die down, you need to close, you cannot sustain themselves anymore. And this happens no matter if there was a shop or if the problem is this prolonged low investment. In the best case, of course, you have to practice schools, kindergartens, medical facilities, all sorts of stuff to them out, rendering it much, much harder for these places to attract families in the future. Some places are very much safe from these dynamics because they are or become tourist destinations. The tourist jobs that are become the tourism industry, they attracted much more diverse residential population. For example, typically more women and more highly qualified people because it's very close. And of course, tourists want to be entertained. So shops and other kinds of entertainment usually can sustain themselves, and the local population also profits from that. Governmental strategies, on the other hand, to further regional development, make these developments worse, actually, with the remaining people. First, because they focus their resources on cities and towns, thinking that all rural areas are always clustered around its urban center. So the thinking is, if you help these urban centers, you automatically also help the rural areas around them. However, since these outlying places now have thinned out a lot, the infrastructure, traffic infrastructures, and our population has declined, these rural areas are not really connected anymore to their urban center, so it doesn't work anymore. And be it because of just traffic infrastructure or simply the mobility patterns of the people don't really match this idea that they, go through all the services in the urban center. It doesn't work. The second piece is that governments around the world are very much focused on fighting high unemployment, which makes all the sense in the world. I'm not criticizing that. However, at this point in my story, these outlying places are not necessarily defined by high unemployment anymore. The unemployment levels. So we can really fly under the radar and not receive the resources that are actually there to guarantee the living conditions across the country. So why do people in these outlying places vote for political parties? So first, the selection text already mentioned. Second, racial grievances, as you have already mentioned. Yes. So they live in the context of decline, with regard to the built environment of decay. They compare the situation with others in the country, with people with relative deprivation of lots of other things going on, and they attribute these grievances to the way democracy functions in the country and to the mainstream parties. That's very short version. Third, we cannot really talk about voting for private parties today without talking about attitudes towards immigration. So how do people in these settlement places who's voted to the development places experience immigration? Locally, not really at all. Because these settlement places, well, they are marked by out migration. They don't attract immigration either from within the country or from other countries. So people living there don't really have the opportunity to develop sustained positive social contact with migrants, which we know is such the most important mechanism of how to challenge negative prejudice views about communities. However, these people in these places are still fully exposed to the national media discourse about immigration that tends to skew, if not towards the negative, then at least towards the alarmist, and that won't fail to read immigration. Well, these outlying places increasingly across Europe are very much targeted by foreign parties. They show a greater presence in these circles. In the very first case scenario, they are actually also targeted by what you could call semi-organized by the right-wing actors trying to become part of the local civil society, providing services and structures that otherwise wouldn't exist anymore. So, for example, local health association, schools, festivals, reading tours, lectures, sporting events, martial arts, book exchanges, welfare organization, children's festival. At least that's what's going on in East Germany. This is not really international field of research, so I only know about East Germany and have no idea what the right-wing actors are doing in France right now. It's, however, at least in Germany, a highly effective strategy. It normalizes far-right ideologies because you simply cannot argue with deeds that are actually good for the community of the country. It's also, and I'm just going to bring that in now, it's also not a new strategy. The last part in Germany indeed is far above average support in rural areas and small towns. And these are precisely because they then showed a presence in these rural areas. So, in the context of this prototypical and fine place, it's now mentioned again. The government metaphorically knocks on your door and tells you we value what you do so much. We want to give you money for more or less money. That immediately challenges his whole impression of being left upon and forgotten by local power. I think that's the idea of the paper with farmers taken as an example of the people who often live in these places and of course they seem direct sentences. Actually, that's my biggest criticism of the paper. Farmers, of course, often live in these places, but not all of them do. And of course, a lot of places post farmers. I don't think it's a problem for you. I think it's an opportunity. The very, very successful far-right Dutch farmers party is a good example of what I'm meaning. The Netherlands, remember, is one of the few countries in Europe that don't really have these places. And yet they have this highly politicized Dutch farming party. Yes, actually kind of strange. So maybe in such context, as an Netherlands, the plight of the farmers' lifestyle forced upon them by their occupation is much more salient to them, a much more marked difference to how everyone else around them lives. And thus they become a highly politicized group. Whereas in farmers living in these behind places, their lifestyle isn't as different from anyone else's because anyone else also is suffering from a lack of opportunity. So in these kinds of places become politicized and not so much farmers specifically. I think now that you have individual data from us, you're actually well positioned to maybe compare how subsidies work on farmers, I'm sorry. Depending on whether they live in that kind of business or not, maybe these subsidies don't have an impact on farmers if they live in these kind of places because the subsidies then don't really address the problems that stem from these contextual reasons. To do that, I would have to measure as my second suggestion, is that behind places more precisely. You think measures for out-migration, overaging, tourism culture, historic developments as well unemployment, or maybe you want to just stop the definition of the OECD. Bring up a really important point. We don't really have to do that. So I agree very much with your models. If you need global discipline measures at all, I don't think you do. Maybe consider regional information criteria or similar provisions. Because I think as grants is very hard to implement this model. Yeah. I mean, not to end on this hugely inspiring comment on Katja. I wonder about the implication of the methods against the background that publicly farming subsidies are really much hated around the world. They constantly are favored in other countries. And I know it's not clear cut, and of course I didn't know what the investments would be, but I want to ask speculatively. If you would have to make a decision, would you say, based on your results, we should increase farming subsidies to fight for voting in the EU? Or would you say, well, actually, what we found means we could decrease these farming subsidies without having to fear too much of the backlash?
Thank you. We've just had a fantastic talk on a really exciting project, followed by some very insightful comments. I'm sure you're all bursting with questions as I am, but before opening the floor, I'm just going to offer Diane an opportunity to pick and choose some of those comments, so we can open straight away.
I mean, I'm going to be super quick because I just want to get as many points as possible, any questions. But thanks so much, Katja, for like very really nice overview of the literature on it and all the kind of puzzles that still existing. I mean, on that you've raised great points, and maybe the two ones that I'm thinking, yeah, like I think we're interested with the survey to understand more like how different the farmers are, because I think like now with observational study, we can't really say much more than okay, it is getting more or less how that lead to climate voting, but I think it'd be interesting if farmers live in rural areas, farmers with women, or if they do different types of farming. And that I think would be something to explore, which will come next. And the second point, which I thought was interesting, is feeling, do all farmers feel isolated? How is that then receiving an income support, which is very individual? How is that then translated at the professional level? And I think this is a point that we were initially interested in, because just to give you some insight on the very briefly on the common agricultural policy, there are two pillars actually. The first one is the 80% is the income support, so that's the funding that we're talking about and talking about data from. The second one, which is also very interested in, especially now with this debate on place-based policy, is funding just to boost the rural areas. It's called rural development. And I think that would be quite interesting to see if there are diffusion effects at the local potential level. Unfortunately, we don't have access to that data after trying really hard. I'm going to try again, but for 7 months we're giving false hope. So we'll see what I can do out of it. But I think that is something we should explore, especially if we bring in the debate on the policy. And it's good that you kind of, without knowing too much on it, you brought it up. So tell me that actually this would be a bit
Thanks so much. We open the floor to a question. We have a question here. It's yes.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I'd like to come at this topic from a historical point of view, and I'd like to pick up from something that Katja mentioned, and you mentioned the Nazi Party. And well, I'm not much of an expert in continental Europe, but at least in Scandinavia, the first parties that kind of were drawn to the whole idea of Nazi ideology and National Socialism were farmers' parties, precisely because National Socialism had this kind of idea of blood and soil ideology of, this whole romantic notion of people living off the land. And I mean, most far-right movements I've encountered in Europe have this kind of notion built in at some capacity. So I'm wondering whether it would be productive, and I don't know how this would be quantified, to look at ideology instead of simple, socioeconomic variance, and how farmers might be a very susceptible group to ideas that have to do with living off the land and the whole romanticism built around it. That's my 2 cents on the issue.
Okay, thank you. Diane, you want to take more? You want to...
I'll take more, but yeah, I like it.
Thank you. Really interesting. It's really interesting. I guess my framing thing, and I think it's a methodological answer, but is this really rural resentment? And so there's a number of things here, and kind of, is this really rural resentment? And you're making, I think, the claim that any radical right vote is a rural resentment indicator. And I wanted to kind of see okay, is this just voting for the incumbent? Because if it's just voting for the incumbent, I get more money, I vote for you. Yeah. It's like wealth, right? Yeah. It's a kind of, basic reward, punishment. I'm wealthier, I'm doing better, this area is doing better. Thank you very much, I will vote for the government. So that was the kind of the first thing, which I think is really, really crucial. If I were kind of, I think when you do this more, when you extend this project, it would be amazing if there was some kind of measure of rural resentment. Yeah. Because you want to say that there's something that exists and it's mitigated by this. And at the moment, we don't know what this is. And coming back to I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, but your Katja's comments, surely it could be immigration, right? I mean, it could be cheap farming labor that could be driving concerns around immigration inflows into bits of areas of the country that are rural. And the other way of dealing with this might be to use like house prices, local house prices, or something like that, where you can at least say that these are areas that do and don't have levels of prosperity that would otherwise make them into this kind of less refined categorization. Some have higher levels of CAP spending and some have lower. And for me, that's kind of, I wanted something that was rural and resentment, that wasn't just, and these people vote for the radical right. There's other things we can chat about as well, just random thoughts, but I think for me that was the main thing.
Yeah. Good, thank you. And so, here at the back, please, yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I can wait. I have to wait for apologies for this. That's already, but also thinking historically about this. and just wondering if you might have a historical control or a comparison of some kind. You're thinking about left behind places in France in the post-war period that did receive a lot of attention, like the Bolet or parts of Brittany that were repeatedly discussed as policy problems by the government, and regional parks were set up to try and encourage economic growth, or shopping center hubs on the outskirts of town to attract businesses. So I guess I'm wondering if you could look at one of these historical examples and see what voting patterns like as a comparison to think about what's happening in the contemporary. I guess I'm just my first go-to, right? Has it changed? Is the current is the current constellation between the far right and payments for farmers different than what it was, for instance, in the 1970s?
Okay, thank you. So maybe you take those three and then we take another round.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, looking into both your points, like from an historical perspective, so that's not really my area by training, but it's good that I have to think more about it. And I really like this idea, the romanticism of nature, which I think is something that was also recurrent in the interviews we had, like the way they felt that they also imposed by the EU or the state to comply to certain practices to make them more green, where in reality, to transfer to that, we're actually generating more, emissions, or it's actually not respectful of the natural landscape, and that is something that, for instance, Maryland kind of used a lot, this kind of romanticism around the importance of nature and landscape. I mean, Farage also used a lot on that idea, the glory of the heritage, and that's something that could happen as well. Like the farmers don't want to be told like to change practices, but that's something that is tied to their heritage and also a way to preserve nature. And so that I think is really interesting, and we might need to explore that, think about that route, or add some questions that could tie that. So I think that's really really helpful. What is rural resentment? Good question. I mean, I was actually brought up the topic. What do I actually mean by that? I still don't really understand. I know there's a lot of measurements of place-based resentment, and in some of my existing research, I try not to use this urban rural divide too much, because I still don't understand what that really means, especially if you think of countries like the Netherlands, where there's high population density. What is it? And I think this is what we try to get at with this mechanism. And so we will include questions on place-based resentment that based on the existing issue in the US. But again, how does that travel to Europe and France? What does it mean to be rural? Is it because you preserve nature? Is it because you consider like a hard worker, or the lifestyle is completely different? Or is it because the rural resentment is because you felt left behind relative to another group that is doing better, right? So is it something due to where you feel like where you live is tied to your identity and that's important, or is it a sense of relative deprivation? That's another thing I don't fully understand what is rural resentment there. So this is why we think I will leave that to the next stage, and hopefully with the interviews and with the survey we can do that. You say it's a methodological question. I mean, if you have any suggestion, I think right now the way to do it. So first of all, we looked at we compared areas that were rural than others, and we saw the effect is stronger, and we really have the rural areas. So we'd say, okay, there's something about being extra rural, like being rural, that is creating this increased support or less support. But we hope that with the survey, we'll add question on place-based resentment of relation to nature. What does it mean to identify as being rural and things like that, and how do you create a sense of grievance or resentment that is existing? And that's, yeah. But you're like, is it going to be common story? That's could be the other side of the coin. I think it's much more exciting to see how we can try to find policy that can mediate issue. Because I know we should that back to this normative question happening, which I don't want to answer, but very that we just compensate for users and everything will be fine. I don't know about this, but anyway, this is a good point, and Thanks for your suggestion on local house funds if we might want to add this. And yeah, and I think, yeah, the historical control could be, yeah, something we might have to think more, like something that this is something that's always been existing, because we've seen an individual change from late 2000s. We thought, yeah, that is something that's wrong, especially when you tie that to the far right and the kind of manifest, not necessarily manifesto, but the way the rhetoric they use, and that can be attracted to this population. We focus on the last 20 years, but maybe interesting to see, like for instance, the father, like Jean-Marie Le Pen, how he also talked a lot more about farmers than Marine Le Pen talks about them. So it could be quite interesting for us to read that.
Okay, thank you. We had often advantage.
Sorry, I'm talking to you.
No, and that's what we get.
But yeah,
On the contrary, please.
Thank you. I mean, I've got a number of issues of like they are connected, and it's about my obsession with contextualization in general. We've been discussing that, right? So the first issue I wanted to point is the political contextualization, and you did mention at the beginning when you showed this table that they were already voting conservative, even though they were getting a lot of funding from the European Union. So that means that we knew that they were going to be conservative. So it's not a big surprise, right?
yeah,
Which then leads to a subsequent question, I think. Are we talking about the continuation of conservatism, or are we talking about radicalization of the farming sector? What does this, what does the data tell us about that nature of voting? So that's my one question, which is more political. And another connected to this is how central is that support for farming in the far right discourse.
yeah,
When Marine Le Pen speaks about farmer support, does she emphasize this? Does she expect the EU to do it? This kind of question. Then I've got a methodological which I have to admit here that I'm not of a quantitative nature. So I wanted to ask you, when you're looking at this connection between support for farming and voting behavior, how do you isolate the other variables? What's the centrality of this particular one in terms of other considerations as well that may affect the voting of farmers? And my last point, if I may, is about the comparative contextualization. We all know that France is a very exceptional case anyway, and that farmers have been always the most probably, demanding farmers in the EU context. So does this make France generalizable? I mean, Katja did put the other cases as well. So when we're discussing farmers, are we discussing about Europe in general or particular methods?
Thank you. I'm going to just jump in and abuse my chest already. First of all, I think it's such an important and stimulating project because indeed we don't know very much about policy allocation at all.
Yeah.
And we don't know very much either what's going on theoretically there. So, really well done for starting the project. And I look forward to the next iteration. I had a few quick comments and questions. So one thing I was thinking about is what it's supposed to be a case of, right? And so you frame it very much precisely as this kind of localized policy response to political issues and economic issues in the place. But I would say, isn't it equally a case of a particular kind of vision getting state-based support? Or indeed, perhaps people who live in a place that don't benefit from these kinds of direct cash payments, but benefit indirectly, so a sort of spillover. And I think depending on which one of the three you want to focus on, it changes a bit than what you second, I wondered about the cap allocation process, right? So I think here for the project, assignment rules are very important, and I don't mean this in the kind of mundane, classic sort of degree exogenous and random kind of comment. I mean it more in the sense of theoretically what's going on, right? Because at some point we say, okay, if I get this because I meeting certain kind of needs or being randomly perhaps. So, you could imagine that you get something because you sort of deserve it. So you're kind of meeting a particular threshold of condition. Scenario one. You could imagine that you're getting something just randomly. It's kind of a lottery, right? I was a farmer, I'm here, and suddenly the EU, for whatever random reason, has decided that they wanted to give me money. And so I get this kind of lottery payment coming. And then you could imagine third scenario, but you get something under particular kinds of conditions. So yes, I'm getting money, but they're making me jump for all sorts of hoops and loops that really antagonize me. So I guess you kind of had a kind of negative policy feedback. So I think here, I mean, all three are great. If you could tell them about, I think that'd be fantastic. And perhaps the third final question comment is, doesn't matter who's keeping the money, right? So it doesn't matter that it's the EU versus your state versus the municipality. And I think that often gets lost in discussions on place-based policy. We don't know very much. Okay, yes, we're receiving policy, and it's a place-based problem. But is it more important it's the state, kind of regional government, canton, nation state, EU, given the fact that here, in a way, Euroscepticism might be a big part of the story. And perhaps that's the response to Jane's comment in a way, is like, it's not just the state give me something and then I can vote for them, right? Because it isn't really maybe the state give. I mean, I don't know how farmers receive this money. If it's the state, then it's a classic kind of. Anyway, sorry, I talked too much, but those are, I mean, I have other comments and thoughts we can discuss by that. So maybe we can either take those two, if there's a third set of questions, basically. So you can just take those two sets of questions and comments.
Yeah, no, fantastic. I'm just going to go to the study. Yes, the last one is that. Is it EU versus state and regional? I have another project that should be important of who is allocating the funds and the relation between trust and what, at least in context of policies to. So another project look at support for mining communities that transitioning away from fossil fuels, and they were looked at the case of Spain, and we've done a lot of interviews there, and the things that came up a lot is where does money come from if I trust the actor that provided the money? And there's a lot of that. The union affiliation is huge, but also the kind of local, it has to come from my province, from the people I know. And so I think that is something we try to get at, is trust. And this is also the thing maybe with the survey experiment, we've been trying to vary a little bit to see whether that has an effect. So I think there must be something that is precisely because the EU is already could be proposed as group among farmers, right? Created a more discontent, knowing that it might come from the group they despise and they see that impose more and more regulations. Anyway, great point. I'm just going to say I like this idea of the parts of the equity and whether you get more or less. Is it because you deserve the farmers feel deserve more? I think that's something we should try to get at. I don't know how we can do it, because I'm not even sure we can really ask this question, but maybe a bit more. We're gonna do some field work, so we can spend like a month traveling around like different farms and talk to farmers, so we can get a better understanding from more ethnographic point of view. And yes, the point on I totally agree with all of that. Is it just that these people are already conservative, or is this radicalization? How is that linked to the rhetoric of the far right? I think that's a great point. It goes a little bit back to James' point that it could just be a immigration issue. It could just be because there's cheap migrants, and that actually activates this anti-immigrant attitudes. And that's something we can maybe exploit with just data, because we have data on immigrants. We also have data on the occupation of immigrants by them, so that could be quite interesting. So if there's an increase in kinship farmers who are migrants, so increase of cheap labor, that could be a good way to get at this idea, and that could maybe link to the rhetoric of the far right, because I don't think anything has changed dramatically in the last. I mean, from what we read, like I don't think it's a huge focus on farmers. Maybe actually been less than used to be in the 70s with the father, that used to kind of really like support among farmers. So I think it could go back to whether people feel left behind, you say, well, we would like this, again, this strategy deprivation, or it is just things going on with the immigration. And that is something we need to do more on this, but it's good that you create like a discussion about what the potential. Yes, I don't want to.
Great, thank you. Do we have more comments and questions, including maybe comments from the discussion again? Harper, please.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm not a sociologist, but I just have a question to understand in terms of the data. You show the results of right-wing parties in certain countries.
Yeah.
How do you isolate the farmers?
Yeah, I mean,
That's my big question, because you do interviews now on farmers, but we use the data of elections in 2004 and 2006 and so on. Because maybe the farmers are not represented. Maybe the farmers are the richest and the best, well, all the others vote right-wing parties. So I didn't understand how you actually interviewed farmers, they receive the money, and then you blend the data on the results, which is much larger community than just the farmers. And when I don't know much about rural areas, but I know that some people resent farmers receiving money from the EU because they say these assholes, they don't do any work. They just say this is environmental protection. They used to have their 25 cows on this land. Now, because they don't farm anymore, they get so many subsidies. And they vote right-wing rather than the people who receive the money.
No, I
Had experiences with farmers, I can tell. You've had bad experiences with farmers.
No, but I'm not 100% sure whether the data
I mean,
and your interviews blend ideally to draw the conclusions.
No, I mean,
That's, maybe I don't understand enough about the data, but that was the question that I had.
It's a good question. We have another question here on the second row, so let's take them in a.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I'm a historian working on rural spaces, so I'm really interested in what you're working on. And I was thinking about according to the last question, we don't have to widen the focus a bit, not only on the common agricultural policy, but also on the structured funds, etc., from the European Union. That also connects to Katja's emphasis on left behind cases. I think it's even more important than agriculture in the present. Perhaps not in the 1960s, but in the present. I would really recommend to include some kind of perhaps just to control your findings with some data about the structure policies, perhaps. Do we find differences between cantons where we have these leader groups, for example, these local groups working on bottom-up development policies funded by the EU? Is there a connection between these structured policies and far-right voting? So is it only agriculture, or is it a question of morality? I think we have to make a difference there.
Thank you. Anyone at the back? Yes, please.
Yeah, I just one more comment. I was wondering if we were looking at the unions, the agricultural unions, as sort of more organized version of the farmers who whether that's gonna go, I'll have, an official stamp on issues.
That's what we're doing. It should be like all the heads. So we need to be all the heads of the unions from all part of political cycle, so from the left wing to the more far right wing. So those are actually the main representatives. We asked them to interviews with farmers and so on.
Can we speak in 4.8 part, please?
Thank you. My question looked like onwards, because there's a really strong assumption right through the paper from the very beginning about this idea of rural resentment. I'm just wondering, if you know, how did you necessarily know that? Because we talk about urban resentment as voting patterns for cities, we'd say, well, that's just one of many factors. It's very difficult to give any precision what urban resentment is. Rural resentment is just presumed to be true, and they have been hugely beneficiaries of these policies. And it might be worth disaggregating the difference between farmers and other people in the countryside who are the rural resentment, in other words, to get back to your point, maybe they're outside the farming community. The farming community have much less resentment than other people living in rural areas. And the assumption was there's something called rural resentment that lumps together farmers and non-farmers living outside of cities. But I wonder if you disconnect that, which is a particular confidence point, is that it's maybe the people that are outside the farming communities, the resentment, and there's the contentment may actually be the farmers because they're actually doing very, very well. They're defending privileges that they've had for very long time. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily the same.
Thank you. So cap resentment in a sense. So yes, ecological fallacy and confounders is my summary for questions. So what
yeah, exactly. I was exactly say that. And we're truly aware of it. I mean, having tried so hard to get data at the individual level, we're thinking of not sure that it would be accessible like getting satellite data on just to see how large the farms are and just correlate that, merge that with the cantonal data that we have. And I totally agree with you that the story is probably just much more than farmers. It could be, and that's kind of music to my ear because that's also the word. I truly believe in that. It's like a kind of localized effect of farmers that could either be supportive, people might be conscious that the farmers, unlike what people think, they sometimes receive what's barely sufficient to maintain, like standard of living, and that could just be sort of support for it, or it could just backfire to some what the points you guys were making, that it seems to be when people feel like they receive the more. So we are actually the truly ones that are feeling that behind, and we in the same time exposed to farmers getting more money. And I think and that goes back to your point about getting more data on the unions and the role of just the farmers. So we're trying to get data on the council at the council level and just to see how many of them are represented by farmers, to see how much of the local power they may have, just to think how integrated they are to the community. Coming from a very rural area, I can tell that they are incredibly powerful. And they are also powerful to generate a sort of rhetoric around what we may call resentment or we may call something else, but more about us versus them, which is. But yeah, anyway, yes.
One data that should be available is the proportion of the vendor funds on actually work with that market sector.
So we do have that.
It used to be huge in France and everywhere it declines. So that would give me some visualization to say if 13% work in the farming community and you look at the electoral data of the whole community, how representative.
So we do have, so I was really brief on it.
So that would enlighten a bit if you can at least.
Yes, so the effect is stronger the larger the agricultural workforce is per canton. So we have this interaction effect. The effect of the larger the share of the pre-canton in 2008, imagine a canton that had a lot of people in this canton working for farms. Well, the effect is stronger in those areas compared to those that have very low share. And we've seen that. So that's why I said it makes, like in the last slide, it is a kind of a validating test to show, okay, there's a direct connection between the share of the farm and the decline of support for the far or increased support for other farmers that we want now. So this is a way to say that we directly link that to it, but I think it's not sufficient. And we need, and I believe that there might be something else going on, in the local area, whether it's diffusion effect or not. And it's something that we plan to do by collecting data on local councillors. Yes, but they could be put to entrepreneurs somewhere, that's what I'm trying to say, they could be the one, you know, rallying forces as we previously think that.
I know Jane, you had still on the same question about the
Yeah.
places in the.
I really liked your argument that local people are annoyed because of farmers, but it would be the exact opposite finding that Diane finds.
Yeah.
So the data, the data run in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you're correct, and I'm not saying you're not, by the way, but if that were true, you should even see increased radical light voting in areas where CAP subsidies are the highest, and you see the exact opposite.
Yeah.
Which suggests to me it's more of a wealth story
Mm.
and a prosperity story,
Yeah.
especially if it's conditional on the proportion of people benefiting from the
Yeah,
subsidy. The number of
exactly,
people
so
working there.
that's, yeah. That is something.
Although I liked it, and I like that, I don't think it's consistent with what we find.
No, it's not. But I think it's still interesting to see, no, you're right, at the tension level, it is not, like the trend is going in the opposite
And it's
direction.
a strong effect.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It is strong and it's consistent across all the different levels we've done, and the one we use is the most conservative one, so you'll get really sentinel change. But it's still unclear to me, and it goes back to, I think, the main trend, all the questions, right, what is really going on there? Is it a West story, is it unique to farmers, is something going on between farmers and other groups? I think it's something to do with the same as well as the rural development policy.
Given that the share of farmers, I would have imagined, is rather small, in a canton of that size, right? So if you have 16,000 or
Yeah.
6 million, you can imagine that, and even though you have what, a few percentage point of the workforce in farming, I would imagine in most cases, quite small. Maybe you're landing yourself in trouble because you're starting from this framing you had when you would have had individual level surveys. If you didn't frame it as something about farming,
Yeah.
but just a policy that affects the countryside,
Mhm.
then all
It
this
does
kind
it.
of, all this kind of.
It does it, like it's in farm support, it's at the individual, at the farm level. It's not rural development policies, it is individual level, and it's
But you
subsidized.
still need the economy cash, right? I mean, you still like.
That's true,
Yeah.
you directly include that, yeah.
I mean, you're keeping a local industry alive.
And people, and
Yeah.
people like that, so I don't think you necessarily have to make a claim about the economic impact of it. It's just that you frame it as basic policy, it's a relatively weak treatment in the sense that, in most places, not. Maybe it is actually, I would have imagined some massive amounts of money,
Mhm.
relative to the economy of a canton on average. Right, especially in a country like France, with the economy is incredible. And so, and nevertheless, even a small policy has a relatively big effect on participation. And then you can say, well, one mechanism might be that the farmers love it, but equally it could be that people around the farming community love it for whatever reason.
Yes.
Or it could be that it's kind of correlated with cohesion funds. It's my understanding is that at some point there was a bit of substitution going on in the commission. But they said we're taking a bit of cap, we're giving it as cohesion funds.
Really?
Well, I mean, it wasn't.
Because that's not the way it's being transferred from that side, it's like different.
It was a kind of political, the French representation in council at some point, they said, look, if you're gonna reduce this, put it as green subsidies or give it to us as cohesion funds, but, they didn't want the member states to lose the entirety. I'm talking about that's 40 years.
No, but that's a good point.
So there could be a bit of a confounding the cohesion funds, I think that's.
Okay.
So anyway, 2 minutes for any burning answers or questions or comments from our panelists or the audience.
I think it asked them, would you consider turning your paper into just splitting it up? One about farmers, with the individual with the other farmers, and one about you explore when you go urban divide and how subsidies and then not just farming subsidies, just rather the broader dimensions that we pay for now, and you can integrate this. Rural resentment, or I think we call it, I'm not a fan of turning cost into an attitude. I mean, it's just rural resentment, it's there for cost. And also, it gives you brought up competition. no theory has received less people support than the competition theories. I would be really surprised if that was going on that farmers feel threatened by the cheap farmers from Poland in Bulgaria doing the work for them that they don't want to do. And certainly don't have any wants to do. I don't think that is a good idea. So I don't think the competition theory.
It was more that people are exposed to immigrants.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
More the-
it's.
Just more the kind of like, yeah, not so much in competition.
Yeah, it's not, there is no, and immigration, it's not immigration, but this is rural areas, that's how the immigrants live.
Yeah, but
Very.
no, but in China, it's like we can see in the UK, there's a lot of cheap migrant labor out there.
Yeah, it's cheap white labor. It's just not, yeah.
It's seasonal also.
Yeah. Yeah, anyway, there's something that, yeah, I mean, it's great, I feel like there's a lot of avenues to get
I'm afraid, I know there's a couple more questions, in fact, that came from the audience now, but as a strict timekeeper, all good things must come to an end. It remains with me to thank Diane for fantastic presentation, Katja for fantastic discussion, and you also coming on a Tuesday of week 3. Getting cold. Thank you, and see you.